The dominant narrative around anxiety, depression, associated medications, and what it is to struggle is predicated on victim consciousness. So through this framework, your illness is an existential question that only you can answer. Your symptoms are literally you telling you about you. And it feels foreign because we've been enculturated around that separation. If we reframe this way and we look at what we're calling depression, we look at what we're calling anxiety as an invitation to explore where in your life you are insisting that fulfillment be available, where it simply is not, and that there's a hero or heroine's journey that you're being invited to embark upon that necessarily involves a dark night of the soul, that necessarily involves the sweet experience of your own courage. Then on the other side of it, you come home to yourself, to the you that you've always been. And that is universally the feedback that I have received from Vital Mind Reset participants and from patients is I feel like myself. I finally feel like I am landing in my own skin. And I actually think that's why so many of us become more attractive, more beautiful as we move through this process, because we're liberating energy from stored trauma spaces in our stress physiology. So if the goal is 360 degrees self-relating, right? It's gaining that perspective on yourself and all of the dimensions of yourself so as to understand the messages that some of the dimensions are holding for your awareness, then you can imagine that fighting with something that you are presenting to yourself, saying no to it, hating it, wanting it to be not as it is, it's just forestalling your progress towards that goal of 360 relating, of total self-embrace, of moving through the shame walls of your own self-rejection, self-betrayal, and self-abandonment in order to claim these precious gems of who you are, right? So it's not like there's a wrong or a right, but if we can agree that the goal is ending all of the wars inside so that you can release, relax, and resolve all of the struggles on the outside with your partner, with your job, with the government, all of this controversy, it begins inside. And I'm a firm believer, as we'll get into, that this journey begins with the reclamation of choice. And what that does to your nervous system is life-changing. When you begin to understand that what you eat for breakfast, that what you buy at the supermarket, let alone grow in your yard, that, what you drink, that how you think, that all of these little choices all day long have vast impact. When you begin to experience that and it comes into your tissues as reality, you can't unknow it. You may grapple with it over time because the readiness factor is the most mysterious of all the variables I've ever explored. Like, what makes somebody ready? And the only thing I've come to is that movement in the direction of change finally feels like relief. It finally feels like, okay, I know there's a lot of uncertainty ahead of me, and I already feel better, that I'm embarking. I also know that this is the beginning stage, right? And what comes next is resolving the fear of life. Alexander Lowen, a psychiatrist, wrote a book by that title, Fear of Life. How could we be afraid of life? I thought we were afraid of dying, right? But there is so much in the reclamation of our eros, in the reclamation of our vital force, and the reconnection to that animating energy that is from somewhere grand, from some place beyond us, that is the sweet terrain of understanding why it would be that we would even deign to move through the more harrowing elements of and phases and passages of this journey. It's to come to the place where the things that you thought mattered so much simply release into, sort of sparkly particles. And honestly, the things that you didn't think matter begin to take on great significance, like what it feels like to put one fork of food into your mouth and experience the sensual pleasure of that. What it is to wake up with a devotional practice, what it is to come into silence and slowness, why would that matter, right? But all of a sudden, these things start to take on immense significance. How you speak to your lover, how you share touch with that person. How is it that we can begin to make love to all of life? What would that look like if you were doing that, right? So contrary to what I've just framed, the dominant narrative around anxiety, depression, associated medications, and what it is to struggle is predicated on victim consciousness. And what I mean by that is that you are encouraged. I call it victim coddling, right? You're encouraged to say, I hate this. This sucks. Why is this happening to me? Please fix it. And who's going to come to the rescue is the system, the doctors, the experts, the gurus with the credentials who are going to tell you about you what you can't possibly know, right? Because you can't possibly know your genes and your brain chemistry and whatever is the theory du jour. And the challenge is that the villain is you. So you are fighting you with the help of the system. And this victim triangle is an endless parade of hat switching experiences of suffering. And it's very familiar. I've had many patients describe to me the validation that they feel when they finally get a diagnosis, their first diagnosis. They feel like, oh, yes, I knew something was wrong with me. And now it's real, right? Now I can see and they agree that something is wrong with me. And it's not my responsibility. It's not my fault. In this warfare model, there is no victory. There is no end. And that silent scream of chronic illness becomes your open air grave. I mean, it's really not even that dramatic of a rendering of the situation to describe it that way, right? So, and you can see how warfare threads through the conventional medical system because you just look at the name of these medications, right? They're all antis, antiemetics, antihypertensives, antibiotics, anti-anxiety, antidepressants, antipsychotics. The fight is very tempting. It's very alluring. And there may be a time where that's exactly what you need to activate your energy. However, it's important that you know what the greater body of scientific literature and research has to say about this model. And that is my effort to provide the groundwork for informed consent that can possibly be made available to you through your prescribing physician. Okay, so let's dive into some myth busting. Firstly, it's a chemical imbalance. You may have heard of serotonin as the happy chemical. This is one of the more pervasive concepts in the hegemony of American culture the world over. And it is taking a long time to die because in 7 decades of published research, there is literally no valid evidence to support the claim that serotonin has anything to do with so-called depression. And again, remember, I'm just putting a spotlight on depression, serotonin, anxiety. You could have this same conversation, pick any so-called brain chemical and any so-called mental illness, and the answer would be the same. There's been more attempts at validating this particular theory than probably any other, and that's what makes it all the more sad. So most recently, Moncrief published an umbrella review, and this essentially is the summary of so many decades of failed research. And what she found was that in tens of thousands of participants, they looked at serotonin metabolites, they looked at concentrations in body fluids, they looked at so-called receptor binding, they looked at postmortem analysis, imaging, tryptophan depletion studies, genetic, gene-environment interactions, and here is her conclusion. Quote, "The main areas of serotonin research provide no consistent evidence of there being an association between serotonin and depression and no support for the hypothesis that depression is caused by lowered serotonin activity or concentrations." And I like to take it a little bit further by invoking a researcher by the name of Andrews, who says, quote, "We also propose that the direct serotonin enhancing effects of antidepressants disturb energy homeostasis and worsen symptoms. We argue that symptom reduction, which only occurs over chronic treatment, is attributable to the compensatory responses of the brain attempting to restore energy homeostasis." So essentially what he's saying is that if there's any benefit, it's because the body is recruiting an adaptation to a poison. Is there a better way? Yes, there is a better way. So why do we think that these medications work? Why might we have the impression that these medications are addressing a so-called chemical imbalance? So again, I'll share some choice quotes I've been collecting in my little bag over the years. The first is by an editor of the British Medical Journal who says, quote, "Unfortunately, in the balance between benefits and risks, it is an uncomfortable truth that most drugs do not work in most patients." End quote. Another by Marcia Engel, who says, quote, "It is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reached slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as an editor of the New England Journal of Medicine." So we think that these medications are addressing a chemical imbalance in no small part because of direct-to-consumer advertising. We in America are one of 3 countries that allow pharmaceutical companies and industry to speak and advertise directly to consumers/patients about theories of biology, health, and illness. And obviously, when it comes to the ways in which media can shape our dominant thought forms, this is non-trivial. So we might think, and really want to think, that science is science. And science, even the word, has this like inbuilt, innate integrity. But there are some aspects of science, especially as it applies to the approval of these medications, that are important for you to know. Like, did you know that it only requires 2 studies for the approval, FDA approval of an antidepressant medication? So you can literally toss a coin over and over and over again until you get heads, and then you can present the 2 heads to the world. So, a now famous study from back in 2008 in the New England Journal by Turner really sought to expose the extent of this data manipulation. And what they analyzed was the 74 studies that were used to approve 12 antidepressants. 38 of these studies were positive, meaning that they showed that there was a benefit to taking an antidepressant. 37 of these 38 were published. 36, very similar number to 38, 36 were negative, showing no benefit. And 3 of these were published as negative, right? However, 11 of them were published with a positive spin, which is why you always have to read the methods and the data, not just the author's conclusion. And 22 of them were unpublished. That explains why we have one impression that is very much disconnected from reality. Irving Kirsch is one of the most important figures in whistleblowing around psychiatry and arguably one of the world's placebo experts. And he worked with a 2008 review where he invoked the Freedom of Information Act, right? Because they hide these unpublished and negative studies in the file drawer. And he invoked their release, right? And what he found was that antidepressants outperformed placebo in only 20 of 46 trials. So that's actually less than half. And the overall difference between drugs and placebo in those outperforming trials was 1.7 on a 52-point Hamilton scale, like literally trivial. So maybe you can start to see how in these short-term trials, there may be an effect. The effect may be inconsistent. It may be minimal. However, what happens in the real world and what happens with the nature of this effect over time? Often there is an invocation of the alcohol analogy, right? So you take somebody who has really bad social anxiety and you put them in a trial and use the placebo arm gets cucumber juice or whatever, and the active arm gets 2 shots of vodka before every, social gathering at night. You could obviously see how over a 6-week or 2-month period, which is a typical time window for one of these trials, that alcohol could be deemed effective, right? That there is an effect. But we wouldn't jump to the conclusion that the people who experience the benefit have an alcohol deficiency or an imbalance. And we wouldn't jump to the conclusion, certainly knowing the nature of the beast, that long-term so-called treatment would be of benefit. So there are many flaws in the nature of the study design. And then even within the seeming benefit, there are a lot of unanswered questions about what that effect actually consists of. And this is a lot of what Kirsch also looked at. So when he found that antidepressants outperform placebo in only 20 of 46 studies, he went on to research and explore the overlapping effect. So what he found is that 12% have a benefit, while 88% have basically all risk. So what is the nature of this benefit? And he went on to research what he calls the active placebo effect. So what happens in a lot of these trials is that patients are, perhaps because of direct-to-consumer advertising or otherwise, made aware of the possible adverse effects of these medications, right? So dry mouth or constipation, racing heart, whatever it might be. And let alone like bleeding and death or whatever. So they're made aware of these initiatory adverse effects. But then they're told, okay, you're either going to be in the sugar pill group or you're going to be getting the antidepressant that we're studying in the hallowed halls of the laboratories, right? So when they start to experience these adverse effects, there is a whole inner pharmacopoeia that is released that is in response to that belief that kicks in saying, I'm being treated now with a medication. I know I am because I have side effects. Something is happening to fix me. So this effect has been researched by comparing antidepressants to other medications like cardiac meds, like atropine, to identify whether or not there is a difference in the so-called benefit. And guess what? Spoiler alert, there isn't. So there are so many aspects of belief at play in the experience of efficacy and also the withdrawal of these medications that, like so many outcomes in medicine, it is essential to assess the mindset of the participants.